The Silent Witness. Chapter 1. The Vanishing. Detective Alex Cross sat behind his cluttered desk, his eyes scanning the files spread before him. He'd been in the homicide division long enough to recognize when something wasn't adding up, and this case was starting to smell wrong. The victim, a well-known journalist named Emily Hayes, had been brutally murdered in her own home. A crime of passion, the police had initially thought. But there was something else, something gnawing at him, like a shadow he couldn't quite grasp. Cross leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin. The more he read, the more it became clear that Emily had been on the brink of exposing something big. Her notes hinted at a story involving high-ranking officials, dirty money, and a conspiracy that reached deep into the heart of the city. But the key to unraveling this web was a witness, someone who had seen everything. That witness was now missing. "Where are you?" Cross muttered to himself, flipping through the pages again, hoping to catch something he'd missed. The witness, an informant named Jason Reed, had vanished without a trace just hours after Emily's murder. There were no leads, no hints, just a cold, dead silence where answers should have been. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was his partner, Detective Sam McGrath, a tall, lanky man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. He held up a piece of paper, his face grim. "Got something," McGrath said, stepping into the office. "Phone records. Our missing witness made a call 2 hours before Hayes was killed." Cross's heart skipped a beat. Who did he call? Someone in the mayor's office. The two detectives exchanged a look. The mayor's office. This just got a whole lot more complicated. As they sat down to sift through the new information, the phone on Cross's desk rang. He answered, expecting another dead-end lead. Instead, a voice he recognized as the chief sparked through the receiver. "Cross, get down to the precinct. We've got a problem." Cross felt the cold fingers of dread slide down his spine. Problems in this line of work rarely meant anything good, and he had the sinking feeling this was going to be one of those cases that stuck with him, that gnawed at him even in the dead of night. He grabbed his coat, signaling to McGrath, "Let's go." As they rushed to the precinct, Cross couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The witness was out there somewhere, but for how long? The deeper they dug, the more dangerous this became. And the more they unraveled, the closer they got to a truth that someone wanted buried. But Cross knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop until he found Jason Reed. Because in this city, secrets never stayed hidden for long. Chapter 2. The First Clue. The precinct was buzzing with activity when Cross and McGrath arrived. Officers hurried past, their faces tense, the air thick with urgency. As they made their way through the crowded hallways, Cross spotted the chief standing by the door to the interrogation room, his broad frame blocking the view inside. His expression was unreadable, a mask of controlled tension. "What's going on?" Cross asked as they approached. The chief gestured for them to follow him into a nearby conference room. Once inside, he closed the door behind them, sealing them off from the noise outside. "We've got a situation. Jason Reed was just found." Cross's heart leapt. "Where? Is he okay?" The chief's eyes darkened. "Not exactly. He was found unconscious in an alley downtown, beaten to within an inch of his life. He's in critical condition at St. Mary's." Cross felt a surge of anger. Someone had tried to silence Reed before he could talk. "Do we know who did this?" The chief shook his head. "Not yet, but there's something else." He handed Cross a small evidence bag containing a blood-stained piece of paper. "This was found on him." Cross took the bag, examining the note through the plastic. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a hurry or under duress. The message was short, just 2 words: "Trust no one." McGrath leaned in, his brow furrowed. "What the hell does that mean?" Cross didn't answer immediately. He was already thinking about the implications, about the fear that must have driven Reed to write those words. Whoever had attacked him was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they were sure Reed would never speak again. "We need to get to the hospital," Cross said finally. "If Reed wakes up, he might be able to tell us who's behind this." The chief nodded. "I've got officers stationed outside his room, but you're right. We need to move fast." As they headed for the door, Cross couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late, that the people behind this were always one step ahead. But they had one thing working in their favor now. They knew where Reed was, and as long as he was alive, there was hope. But as they made their way to the hospital, Cross couldn't stop thinking about the note. "Trust no one." The words echoed in his mind, a warning or perhaps a clue. In this case, they couldn't afford to take anything at face value. Everyone was a suspect, and the truth was more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Chapter 3. The Hospital Room. The sterile smell of antiseptic hit Detective Alex Cross as soon as he entered St. Mary's Hospital. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh, white glow on everything, amplifying the sense of urgency that had gripped him since the moment they'd found out about Jason Reed. Cross walked briskly down the corridor, McGrath at his side, both men silent, focused. As they approached Reed's room, two uniformed officers stood at attention outside the door. One of them, Officer Daniels, nodded to Cross. "No one's been in or out since we got here, Detective." Cross acknowledged him with a curt nod before turning the handle and stepping inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small lamp on the bedside table. Jason Reed lay motionless in the bed, his face bruised and swollen, a mess of tubes and wires connecting him to various machines. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Cross moved closer, studying Reed's battered face. It was a miracle he was still alive, but just barely. The doctors had managed to stabilize him, but he hadn't regained consciousness since they brought him in. McGrath hovered by the door, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting danger to leap out from the shadows. "Think he'll make it?" Cross shook his head, uncertain. "I don't know, but we need him to. He's the only one who can tell us what he knows." As they stood in silence, the door behind them opened, and a nurse stepped in, carrying a clipboard. She was young, with tired eyes and a calm demeanor that spoke of long hours in the ER. "Detectives," she greeted them quietly. "I'm Nurse Collins. I've been assigned to Mr. Reed's case." "Any changes in his condition?" Cross asked, his voice low. She shook her head. "None, but we're doing everything we can. The head trauma was severe, and he's in a medically induced coma to help with the swelling. It's too soon to tell when, or if, he'll wake up." Cross nodded, though the news wasn't what he wanted to hear. "Is there any chance he might have been able to say something before he lost consciousness? Anything at all?" The nurse hesitated, glancing at the clipboard before meeting Cross's gaze. "There was one thing," she said slowly. "When the paramedics found him, he was trying to say something. They couldn't make out the words, but they think it was a name. A woman's name." Cross leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "A name? Did they hear what it was?" Nurse Collins frowned, clearly struggling to recall the details. "They think it started with an M. Maybe Margaret or Mary. They weren't sure." Cross exchanged a look with McGrath. "Could be important. We need to look into any connections Reed might have had with a woman by that name." The nurse nodded. "I'll keep you updated if anything changes." As she left the room, Cross turned back to Reed. The man was teetering on the edge of death, and yet he had tried to communicate, tried to warn them about something or someone. But who was this woman? And how did she fit into the puzzle? McGrath cleared his throat, drawing Cross's attention. "We're missing something, Alex. We've got Reed, but if he doesn't wake up, we're back to square one. We need to follow up on that name, dig deeper into his background." Cross nodded, already making a mental list of the next steps. "Let's start with his phone records and emails. If this woman is involved, there's bound to be something there." And we need to keep a close watch on Reed's room. Whoever did this might try to finish the job. McGrath agreed, his expression grim. You think someone from the mayor's office is behind this? Cross sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's possible, but until we have more to go on, I'm not ruling anything out. All we know for sure is that someone wanted Reed dead, and they're not going to stop until they succeed. As they left the hospital room, Cross felt a gnawing sense of unease. They were closer to the truth than ever, but with every step forward, the danger increased. The name Reed had tried to speak haunted him. Who was she? A friend? An enemy? Or something far more dangerous? The deeper they dug, the more tangled the web became. And with Reed unconscious, they were running out of time to find the answers they needed. Chapter 4. The Secret Contact. The sound of the rain drumming against the windows provided a bleak soundtrack as Cross and McGrath sifted through the records from Jason Reed's phone. The dimly lit office felt even more oppressive under the weight of the case. They'd been at it for hours, combing through endless texts, emails, and call logs, searching for anything that might lead them to the elusive him. Cross's eyes burned from the strain, but he refused to stop. This case was becoming an obsession, one that wouldn't let him rest until it was solved. His instincts told him that Reed's attackers wouldn't wait long before making another move. The clock was ticking. Got something? McGrath announced suddenly, breaking the silence. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. There's a series of texts here from an unknown number. The last one came through just minutes before Reed disappeared. Cross moved closer, reading the messages over McGrath's shoulder. The texts were brief, cryptic, but one stood out. *, we need to meet. The mayor knows. Tonight, usual place. *. Cross's pulse quickened. There she is. But where's the usual place? McGrath frowned, scrolling through more messages. No mention of it anywhere else in the logs. But there's another call to that same number an hour before. I'll trace it, see if we can get a location. As McGrath worked on tracing the call, Cross's mind raced. If Reed was meeting this woman, that night she might hold the key to everything. But the fact that the mayor was mentioned complicated things. It meant they were dealing with someone who had power, someone who could make people disappear. Got it, McGrath said triumphantly. The call pinged off a tower near the docks. That's gotta be the meeting spot. Cross felt a surge of adrenaline. The docks were a notorious area, filled with abandoned warehouses and derelict buildings. A perfect place for a clandestine meeting. Let's go. We need to check it out before someone else does. The two detectives grabbed their coats and headed out into the storm. The drive to the docks was tense, the rain pounding against the windshield, the wipers barely keeping up. As they approached the area, the city's bright lights faded into the distance, replaced by the eerie darkness of the waterfront. They parked the car a few blocks away and approached on foot, the rain soaking through their clothes, the cold biting into their skin. The docks were deserted, the only sound the lapping of the water against the rotting piers. They moved cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of life. Finally, they spotted a small, dilapidated warehouse, its windows boarded up, the door hanging slightly ajar. Cross gestured for McGrath to follow him, and they moved in silently, their footsteps muffled by the rain-soaked ground. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The darkness pressed in around them, broken only by the weak beam of Cross's flashlight. They moved deeper into the building, every creak of the floorboards echoing ominously. Then they saw it, a faint light coming from a room at the back of the warehouse. Cross held up a hand, signaling for McGrath to stay back as he approached the door. He could hear muffled voices inside, someone speaking in hushed tones. Taking a deep breath, Cross pushed the door open, his gun at the ready. Inside, a lone figure sat at a rickety table, a dim lantern casting shadows across the walls. It was a woman, her face hidden by the hood of her coat. She looked up as Cross entered, her eyes widening in fear. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Detective Alex Cross," he replied, lowering his weapon slightly but keeping it ready. "I'm here about Jason Reed." At the mention of Reed's name, the woman's expression changed, fear giving way to something else, resignation. She lowered her hood, revealing a face marked by worry and exhaustion. "I'm Em," she said quietly, "but you're too late. They're already coming for me." Cross felt a chill run down his spine. Before he could ask who they were, the sound of tires screeching outside filled the air, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Cross and McGrath exchanged a look of alarm. Whoever had been hunting Jason Reed was here, and they had just walked into the trap. Chapter 5. The Trap Springs. The sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. Cross motioned for McGrath to take cover behind a stack of crates while he positioned himself beside the door, his gun trained on the entrance. Em remained seated, her eyes darting around the room, clearly terrified. Cross's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment everything could go horribly wrong. They had no idea how many people were out there or how well armed they might be. But they were out of options, and the only way forward was to face whatever was coming head-on. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. A tall, muscular man with a cold, calculating expression. He was dressed in a dark suit, an expensive one, and he carried himself with the air of someone who was used to getting his way. Behind him, 2 more men entered, both armed and scanning the room with practiced precision. Cross stayed perfectly still, his finger hovering over the trigger, waiting for the right moment. The lead man's gaze fell on Em, and he smiled, a chilling, predatory grin. "Hello, Margaret," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "I see you didn't take our warning seriously." Margaret, so that's who Em was. Cross's mind raced as he tried to piece together the connection. But there was no time to dwell on it. The man raised his hand, signaling his henchmen to move forward. They advanced on Em slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. That's when Cross made his move. He stepped out from behind the door, his gun aimed squarely at the leader. "Freeze! Drop your weapons!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. The men froze, their eyes widening in surprise. The leader's grin faltered, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You've made a mistake, detective," he sneered, his hand twitching toward his pocket. "Don't even think about it," Cross warned, stepping closer. "Put your hands up now." For a moment, it seemed like they might comply. But then, everything happened at once. The leader lunged for his pocket, pulling out a sleek, black pistol. Cross fired, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the man in the shoulder, sending him sprawling to the floor. The other 2 men reacted instantly, raising their weapons and firing in Cross's direction. Cross dove behind the crates, bullets whizzing past him, splintering the wood. McGrath returned fire from his position, his shots precise, forcing the attackers to take cover behind the doorway. Margaret scrambled off her chair, crawling toward the crates where Cross was taking cover. "You have to get out of here," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the gunfire. "We're not leaving you," Cross replied, his eyes scanning the room for an escape route. They were pinned down, and the odds were not in their favor. The firefight intensified, the sound of gunshots reverberating through the warehouse. Cross knew they couldn't hold out much longer. They needed to find a way to tip the scales, and fast. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something, an old, rusted fire escape ladder leading up to a second-floor landing. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. "McGrath!" Cross shouted over the noise. "Cover me! We're heading up!" McGrath nodded, laying down suppressive fire as Cross grabbed Margaret and pulled her toward the ladder. They sprinted across the room, bullets striking the ground around them, But by some miracle, they made it to the ladder unscathed. Cross climbed first, helping Margaret up behind him. The metal groaned under their weight, but it held. McGrath was the last to climb, and just as he reached the top, the attackers burst into the room, guns blazing. Cross fired down at them, forcing them to retreat behind cover. "We need to move," he yelled, leading Margaret and McGrath toward a broken window on the far side of the landing. It was a risky escape, but it was the only option left. They reached the window, and without hesitation, Cross kicked out the remaining glass and climbed through, dropping down onto the roof of a nearby building. Margaret followed, then McGrath. They ran across the rooftop, the rain slick beneath their feet, the sound of shouts and gunfire echoing behind them. When they finally reached the edge of the roof, Cross spotted a narrow alleyway below. "We jump," he said, breathless but determined. Without waiting for a response, he jumped, landing hard on the wet pavement below. The impact sent a jolt of pain through his legs, but he pushed it aside, turning to help Margaret and McGrath as they followed. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the car, parked several blocks away. Cross threw open the door, and they all piled in, gasping for breath, soaked to the bone. As Cross started the engine and peeled away from the curb, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The warehouse was disappearing into the distance, but he knew this wasn't over. Whoever was after Margaret wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. He had more questions than answers now, but one thing was clear: this case was far bigger than he'd ever imagined. And if they were going to survive, they'd need to stay one step ahead of a relentless enemy. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time they reached the safe house, a nondescript apartment in a quiet part of town that Cross used for situations exactly like this. He pulled the car into the garage, closing the door behind them, and the three of them sat in silence for a moment, catching their breath. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice shaky but resolute. "I should have told you everything sooner," she said, looking at Cross with a mix of guilt and fear. "But I was scared. They have eyes everywhere." Cross nodded, his expression serious. "You need to start talking, Margaret. Who are they? And what do they want from you?" She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for the storm that was about to break. "My name is Margaret Lawson," she began. "I was the mayor's executive assistant for the past 5 years. I was close to him, closer than I should have been. But that's not what put me in danger." Cross and McGrath exchanged a glance, urging her to continue. "A few months ago, I stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "The mayor was involved in some very dark things. Corruption, yes, but more than that. He was working with some very powerful people, people who aren't afraid to kill to keep their secrets." Cross leaned forward, his mind racing. "What did you find?" Margaret hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. "This," she said, holding it out to Cross. "It's all on here. Financial records, communications, proof of everything. I copied it from the mayor's private files." Cross took the drive, feeling the weight of it in his hand. This was it, the key to the whole case. But it also painted a target on their backs. And Jason Reed? How does he fit into this? Margaret's eyes filled with regret. "He was a reporter. He came to me asking questions about the mayor. I knew he was onto something, so I gave him just enough information to keep him interested, but not enough to put him in danger. But then he found out about the drive, and I made the mistake of trusting him with it." McGrath's expression darkened. "So when they found out, they came after both of you?" Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "They got to Jason first. I don't know how, but they found out he had the drive and tortured him to find it. But Jason didn't tell them it was still with me the whole time. They left him for dead, and I knew I was next, so I ran. But they've been hunting me ever since." Cross felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay focused. "We need to get this to the FBI," he said, pocketing the USB drive. "They'll have the resources to take down the mayor and whoever he's working with." But Margaret shook her head, her fear palpable. "You don't understand. These people, they have connections everywhere. I've seen it firsthand. If you go to the authorities, they'll know, and they'll come after us before you can even finish the report." Cross considered her words, the enormity of the situation settling in. She was right. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt official. This was about surviving long enough to expose the truth. "We can't trust anyone," Margaret continued, her voice trembling. "Not the police, not the government. The only reason I'm still alive is because I've kept moving, never staying in one place too long. They won't stop until they find me, until they have that drive." Cross thought for a moment, his mind working through the options. "Then we need to go on the offensive," he said finally. "We need to use the information on this drive to force their hand, make them come to us on our terms." McGrath looked skeptical. "And how do we do that? We're dealing with powerful people here, Alex. They're not going to back down just because we have evidence." Cross met his partner's gaze, a plan forming in his mind. "We're going to expose them," he said firmly. "We'll leak the information bit by bit, to the press, to the public. We'll make it so they can't cover it up, so the whole city knows what they've been doing." Margaret's eyes widened in alarm. "But they'll come after us, after me." Cross placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know, but if we do this right, they won't have anywhere to hide. They'll be too busy trying to cover their tracks to come after you. And we'll be there, watching their every move, ready to take them down." It was a risky plan, one that could easily backfire. But it was the only way to ensure that justice was served, that the people responsible for this would pay for their crimes. Cross knew they were stepping into dangerous territory, but he also knew they had no choice. "Let's get to work," he said, his voice steady. "We've got a conspiracy to bring down." As they began to lay out their plan, Cross couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a razor's edge. The enemy was powerful, relentless, and they were in deeper than they'd ever been before. But they had something the others didn't, the truth. And as long as they held on to that, they had a chance. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the city shrouded in a quiet, uneasy calm. But Cross knew that calm wouldn't last. The storm was far from over. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.